Good morning and welcome to the second of our Tudor lessons, looking at how Tudor music was played, performed, where it was performed, how it was performed, and the whole history of sort of Tudor music, because it was very different to modern music because of the sounds that were made, the instruments that were used, and the different scales and things that were used as well. And we're looking at a little bit more of that today. And specifically, we're going to be looking at Tudor church music. So it's quite different from what we did last week, which was looking at the different instruments that were around, and virginals and viols and sackbuts and all of those sort of instruments. And if you didn't see last week's lesson and you'd like to catch up on it, it is here on our YouTube channel. So let's get on. Let's have a look at what we're going to be doing today. So let's just do a little bit of a recap. When is the Tudor period? So we're looking at a period of history that is between 1485 and 1603. And it's the start of the Tudor dynasty. The Tudors, that's the name, their sort of surname, if you like. And we're thinking about kings like Henry VIII, but the very first Tudor was Henry VII when he beat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. And it takes us all the way through to the end of Elizabeth I's reign. Now, Henry VIII was a Catholic, and this is to do specifically with church music today. And when he came to the throne, he was a Catholic. Now, that means that he followed the teachings of the Catholic Church with the Pope as head of the church all the way over in Italy. And all of the churches in Britain, in England, were Catholic churches. All of them. He was married to a lady called Catherine of Aragon, and he wanted an heir to the throne. He wanted a son. Now, Catherine had had a baby. She'd had a little girl, and she'd called her Mary, and she later on became Queen Mary. But Henry wanted a son, and Catherine just wasn't able to have any more children. So Henry decided that he wanted to get the marriage annulled. In effect, a divorce. So he asked the Pope if he could divorce Catherine, and the Pope said no. Henry wasn't too pleased about this, as you can probably imagine. But, you know, the Pope's word was that's basically what you have to do. Now, Henry had always been a very devout Catholic. He used to go to daily mass, which is the church service. He would go on pilgrimages to places like Walsingham in Norfolk, where there is a shrine, and he was a very devout Catholic. But in 1534, Henry was made the head of the English Church by an Act of Parliament, and this meant that he could then divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. And it also meant that he could take all the properties and lands and money from the monasteries and the abbeys, and he basically sold them off to rich noblemen and rich lords and so on to get the profits. So as king, he had all the money. He took all of the money from the monasteries and so on. And we call that the Reformation. It's the reforming of the church. And so all of these monasteries, all of these church lands were closed down, dismantled. You'll see ruins of abbeys and monasteries all across England that you can visit, a lot of them owned by English Heritage and people like that. And he sort of took them all apart and sold off all the lands, took all the money out of the church, and basically turned England into a Protestant country, which meant it didn't follow the teachings of the Catholic Church that it had before, as in the Pope was no longer in charge. Now, that had a big historical effect on everything, because it meant that the Bible was translated into English. This is the first time it was translated into English. Up until then, it had been in sort of Latin and other languages. And Henry authorized it to be read, the Bible to be read in English churches as part of the Church of England's services, so that the ordinary people were hearing the Bible being read in their own language. The Lord's Prayer was also said in English, and until then, everything had been in Latin. So ordinary people wouldn't really have understood what they were listening to, and now they could, because the ordinary man in the street wouldn't have learnt Latin. Latin was a language that was used by people that were very learned, that had been highly educated, that were normally very rich as well. If they were being, lords and ladies and people like that, they would be able to understand the Latin. People that were involved with the monasteries and the abbeys, they would be able to understand Latin, but ordinary man, ordinary peasant who was a farmer or whatever, wouldn't have been able to understand it. Not everybody was happy about the church becoming the Church of England. Not everybody was happy, but end of the day, if you disagreed with Henry, you faced death. So you didn't really have a lot of choice. There were people that did face that, which, that's quite a big thing, isn't it? It's quite a big thing. Now, the church was an important part of Tudor life, because the church, everything had really, a lot of things had revolved around the church, because the church had been very rich under the Pope and monasteries and so on. They would have had a lot of land. They would have had tenant farmers. The church held a lot of power. You did what the church said. So there was, it was a very important part of people's life. And music was also a very important part of worship. You would have choirs in your churches that would sing the service in Latin. And we associate Latin with Italy and the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church. And even now in the Catholic Church, you will hear quite a lot of Latin said. If you go to a mass, for example, and we'll look at things like that in a minute, the words that are being used, Agnus Dei, and things like that, it's Latin. Okay. Church music was usually sung unaccompanied. Now, the posh word for that is a cappella. So it means that there's no instruments. It's just you, your voice, or collection of voices that are all singing together. No instruments. So that's quite important. And it's quite difficult, actually, to sing a cappella and hold your line and not wander off. If you've got other instruments playing along with you, it's much easier to sort of hold your part. But performing a cappella was really quite a challenge. So let's have a look at the most important types of church music that there were, the types of pieces of music that would be sung in church. So the most important types of church music were things called the Mass, the Motet, and the Anthem. So let's just have a look at these individually. So the Mass, it's a set of pieces based on the church service that's called a Mass. And it's sung in Latin. And as I was saying, you've got different sections of it, things like the Agnus Dei and so on, that you sing as part of the church service. And there's been lots of masses written during history. Obviously, we're talking specifically about the music in Tudor times, but even people, Mozart wrote a Requiem Mass. If we think of Fauré, who was around fairly recently, in musical terms, we're not talking 400 or 500 years ago, we're talking 100 years ago, he wrote a Requiem Mass as well. So the Mass is still there as a musical form, but it's not being sung in English churches as part of the service on a regular basis. That stopped with the Reformation. We also have something called a motet, which is a type of religious song. Now, this is usually in 4 parts, and again, it's often sung in Latin. And it was based on. Have I gone too far? There we go. Motets were based on modes that are a bit like a modern day scale. Okay. These scales, they all had special names. And we're going to have a little look at one of those right now. So we looked at a few weeks ago chords and how chords are used in music. And we looked at scales as well, because we found out that chords are built on the notes of a scale. And so the scale that I've written down here is the D major scale. And the pattern for this D major scale is tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. That's how you move to choose the notes that are being played for the scale. So that all major scales, doesn't matter, I'm going to play the D major scale. Because I started on the note D. But if I played a G major scale, or a C major scale, the pattern stays the same. I'm just starting on a different note. Now I'm using the D major scale as an example because we're looking at the Dorian mode. It starts on a D. So D major scale. Now let's listen to the Dorian mode, because the Dorian mode starts on a D, but it doesn't have an F sharp, it has a normal F. It doesn't have a C sharp, it has a normal C. So it sounds very different. Okay, I'll play that for you one more time so you can just hear how different it is. Now, composers do still compose in modes today, but we tend to use, majority of the time, major scales and minor scales, and those are the sort of 2 scales in Western music that tend to be used the most. But these modes, Dorian mode, Aeolian mode, they've all got different names depending on what note they start on, and it's their pattern that is important. So that's our Dorian mode, and it gives the piece a very unique sound. And we'll be hearing some music using modes in a moment. The last type of music that we're going to look at is something called an anthem, and this is the piece that we're going to really look at today. An anthem is a short, sacred, which means religious piece, and it's usually sung in English. And this is where this change comes about, because this is one of those pieces that was started being written specifically for the English church, the English anthem. So composers started to write music specifically for the Church of England, the English church, after the Reformation, after all of this music, of this change in history. Now, let's be clear, things didn't go smoothly, because during the Tudor sort of reigns, from 1485 right through to 1603, things changed a few times. So yes, Henry VIII changed everything. So we had the Protestant church, the Church of England. But then after Edward, Queen Mary came to the throne, Henry's daughter. Now she was a Catholic, and so she wanted people to worship under the Catholic Church. She followed the Pope's teachings. And then when Mary died, Queen Elizabeth I became queen and was monarch, also Henry's daughter. And she was a Protestant, so she believed in her father's idea of the Church of England. So you can imagine that if you were a person living through this time, it must have been very difficult and confusing for people. Because when Queen Mary was on the throne, if you were practicing religion as a Protestant, you could be killed. And then when Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne, and if you worshipped as a Catholic, you could be killed. And so it was a very difficult time for people to sort of be living in religion wise, because you didn't really know whether you were coming or you were going, I suppose. Choose the wrong one and you could be killed, just depending on which king or queen was in power at the time. We're going to have a little look at a particular composer called Thomas Tallis. Now, he was born in 1505, so he covers the sort of the Tudor monarchs, their reigns. He's very much within Tudor history. He was a Catholic, and his job was the choir master at Waltham Abbey. So when the dissolution of the monasteries happened under Henry VIII, he basically lost his job. But he wasn't just a choir master, he also wrote music as well. And he managed to stay in favour with Queen Mary and Elizabeth, and wrote music for the Catholic Mass. But then he also wrote new music for the New English service as well. And most of his music was composed to be used in church. He wrote a Latin motet. This is probably one of his most famous pieces of music, called Spem in Alum. And it's got 40 parts. Just absorb that. 40 parts. That's 8 choirs of 5 parts each. So you've got 40 different things happening all at the same time. And it's unaccompanied, and it's just voices. That is quite astounding. Because today we'd think of 40 parts performing at the same time. We'd think of an orchestra, or with something like that. Yeah, that makes sense, having 40 parts. But vocally, 40 parts all singing at the same time. That's quite something. It's huge, huge, huge thing. We're actually going to be looking at one of his pieces of music. And the piece of music we're going to be looking at is an anthem. So I'm going to just disappear so that when I put the next thing up, you can, there we go. So in front of you, you have a piece of music written down by Thomas Tallis, and this is how the music would have been written. It's a piece of music, it's an anthem called Why Fumeth in Sight. Now, today we write all the parts for a piece of music underneath each other so that we can read them all at the same time. So if you've got somebody conducting, they can see everything that's going on in the piece of music at the same time, and they can follow the parts. And very often in vocal music, when choirs are singing, they also have all 4 parts, or however many parts there are, written down underneath each other so they can see what each other are doing, and they know how their piece fits into the whole piece. In Tudor times, that's not how it worked. In Tudor times, each piece of, or part of the music would be written down individually. So this is just one part of this piece, and there were 4 parts to this piece which would be all sung together. So we can see what's called the mean part, the top part, and then there would be another part that's actually written underneath on the page, a third part which would be written on a separate page, and the 4th part would be written underneath the 3rd part within the book that they were using. Okay, now have a look at this piece of music, and while you're having a look at it, think about, is there anything else that is different about how it's written down compared to what we would consider modern notation? Can you identify anything else that is very different from what we would consider modern musical notation? And while you're doing that, I am going to play you Why Fumeth in Sight. Now, the one thing I would say, and I say this every time, in for theatre of music, we can't use recordings of other people performing pieces of music because of copyright, understandably. So whenever we do something like this and we play you something, we've had to create it ourselves. Well, I've had to create it myself. So this piece of music is me singing all four parts. However, and this is a very big thing, in Tudor times, that wouldn't have been at all possible, because it would be men and boys who were singing these anthems and things in church. Girls and women were not allowed to be part of choirs and to perform. And if you think about Shakespeare and Shakespearean plays, you might remember that girls weren't allowed to be on stage and be actors and so on. All the parts were played by boys. So although you're going to hear all four parts, it's me singing it, and normally it would have been men and boys because girls were not allowed to sing. Okay, certainly not in public like that as part of a choir. So here is Fumeth, Why Fumeth in Sight by Thomas Tallis, while you're having a look at that piece of music.
Why fumeth in sight the Gentile spite, in fury raging stout? Why take thin hand the people fond, vain things to bring about? The kings arise, the Lord's devise, in councils met thereto, against the Lord with false accord, against his Christ they go.
Okay. Now, as you were listening to it, that might have helped you with how things were very different. So let's go through a few of these things. And you might have jotted things down on a piece of paper if you're using the resources that are on the live page on our website. You've got some space to write things down. But let's just have a little look at it. So first of all, the language. It's quite difficult to read the words because it's written in a way that is very different to how we write today. So some of these words, it's difficult to work out what they are. There's no treble clef at the beginning to tell us that we're singing a high part, or a bass clef to tell us that we're singing a low part. What they're actually using is like a box. So if we look at the second line down, because I think it's easier to see it there, on the second line down, you've got this weird sort of two lines and then sort of like two little boxes inside those two lines. And the line that goes between those two little boxes, which is the second line up, is where middle C is. So middle C can move around on the lines. It doesn't have to stay in the same place. There are some sharps in this piece of music, and they're indicated by an X next to the note so that we know that those are actually, they're G sharps. And that sharp carries on until another note is played, and then you would have to rewrite the sharp sign. The shapes of the notes are different. So you've got like diamond note heads, and then the stem is coming from the middle of the note. It's not from the side like we write down musical notation. So you can see, and we've not really gone into any depth here, there's a lot that's very different about how a piece of music back then was written down. And it's quite complex. It's quite difficult perhaps to decipher. So there it is, written down in modern notation. Let's see how you get on with this one. So it's all the parts. This part's written down in modern notation. It's not the part that you saw before. It's a different one out of the set of 4. It's a typical anthem because there's lots of time signature changes. So the time signature is the number, if you remember, at the beginning. But you can see that we're in 6/2. That's 6 minim beats in a bar. We're used to a 4 at the bottom, which is when we're counting in crotchets. But this is in minims, and we're counting 6 in a bar in the first bar. But then it changes, and we go into 5/2. And then a little bit later, it changes again at bar 4 into 4/2. And then it goes back to 6/2. But there is an actual regular pattern to this. So we've got 6/2, 5/2 for 2 bars, and then 4/2. And then we go back to 6/2, 5/2 for 2 bars, and 4/2. And it carries on doing that throughout the piece. So it gives it a regular meter, a regular pattern. But I don't know, it gives it a strange feel as well, the timings of it. Early anthems were made as simple as possible so that the words could be easily heard, because they wanted people to be able to hear these English words and be able to understand it. Let's have a little go at learning this part together. Before we do, let's just listen to it one more time, and you can follow the words perhaps a little more easily this time. So we'll do it with all 4 parts, and have a listen and follow the words.
5 youth in sight, the Gentiles sight, in fury raging stout. Why take thin hand, the people fond, vain things to bring about? The kings arise, the Lord's device, in councils met thereto, against the Lord with false accord, against his Christ they go.
Okay, let's see if we can learn just the beginning of it. It doesn't matter if we don't do the whole song. So that's the first bar. Why fumeth in sight. So instead of saying fumeth, because you can't get, it's 2 syllables, you can't get it on one note. Why fumeth in sight. Okay. The next bar, the Gentiles spite. Okay, so let's try it together. Why fumeth in sight, the Gentiles spite. Now we stay on that note. In fury rage, and then go up. Jinxed out. Let's just try that little bit. Do it together. 3, 4. Why fumeth in sight, the Gentiles spite, in fury raging stout. Okay, happy with that? We'll do it one more time. Okay, after I'll do a 3, 4, and then we'll come in. 3, 4. Why fumeth in sight, the Gentiles spite, in fury raging stout. Let's have a look at the next little bit. We're not going to do all of it, but we'll have a little look at the next little bit. You should be able to see how the shape, if the music goes up, your voice goes up and goes higher. If the shape comes down, if the notes come down, you come down and you sing lower. So the next bit, we've got a bit of a jump. And again, we're shortening a word. Why taketh is the word, but we're going to do why taketh. Why taketh in hand the people fond, Let's try that. Why take thin hand, the people fond, and we stay on that note like we did before, vain things to bring about. Now you can see what I mean about this Dorian mode and the sort of the use of the scales that they're using. It gives it a very, I suppose we would think of it as a very English sound. It makes the music sound very English, but it gives it a specific sound depending on what type of mode you're using. So let's go from why take thin hand after 3, 4, 3, 4. Why take thin hand, the people fond, vain things to bring about. So let's try all of that first little bit together. So that's half of the song. That's half of the song. Let's do it together. 3, 4. Why fume thin sight, the Gentile spite, in fury raging stout? Why take thin hand, the people fond, vain things to bring about? Let's do it one more time. Okay? After 3, 4. 3, 4. Why fume thin sight, the Gentile spite, in fury raging stout? Why take thin hand, the people fond, vain things to bring about? Now, let's try it and see if you can sing your part with the other 3 parts all being sung at the same time as part of the whole anthem. So you only need to sing that first bit, but if you think there's a bit you can join in with the bit after, by all means give it a go. And it's something you could practice yourself because the track is on the live page on the website as a resource, along with the little pack that tells you the history and gives, it's got the music written there, both the original version and this version where you've got it in modern notation. So let's give it a go. Why fume thin sight, the Gentile spite, in fury raging stout? Why take thin hand, the people fond, vain things to bring about? Let's just try that one bit one more time and then we'll let it play through to the end. Okay, so that's the note you're starting on. Why fume thin sight, the Gentile spite, in fury raging stout? Why take thin hand, the people fond, vain things to bring about? The kings arise, the Lord's device, in councils met thereto, against the Lord with false accord, against his Christ they go. Okay. So let's do a little recap of what we've learnt today. What have we learnt today? We have learnt that music in Tudor times was actually quite different from music today, certainly within the church. And music was unaccompanied a lot of the time in church. You'd got mass, you'd got motets, you'd got anthems. And a lot of the music had been written in Latin originally, but it was starting to be written in English, particularly because of the Reformation and the whole history of that and the effect that had on music of the church. And the anthems were kept very simple, like the piece we've just been singing, but the emphasis was on the words so that you understood what you were singing. Now, next week, we're going to move on from church music and we're going to be looking at sort of, I suppose, the pop songs of the day, the madrigals and the airs. These were the normal sort of songs that would be sung, and how they were sung and how they were accompanied and all of that. We're going to look at that next week. And we'll probably have another little look at how music was written down and the differences between how music was written then and how music is written now. So that's what we're going to be focusing on next week. As always, I'm just going to sort of say, go to the website, have a look on our website and have a look at the resources. Go to the live page, live lessons page, have a look at the resources that are on there that are linked to each of the lessons that we've been doing. And also have a look at some of the other resources we've got, because there are things to do with music theory, how you read music, how you write it down. There's things to do with people that are famous within music, people like pop music like David Bowie, or classical composers like Mozart. But we've also got listening activities and composing activities and performing activities and information about people's birthdays and when they died. So looking at specific, births and dates and things like that, so that you can find out about people that were born on particular days. There's a whole list of things there. We've got lots and lots of different things on there, all to do with music, all for free. But if you feel that you could help pay my wages and be able to make me, give me the opportunity to be able to create even more, please do visit the coffee page for Theatre of Music, which you can see the information on there. There's a QR code, but there is also a link, a sort of web link, which I will move out of the way so that you can see. It would be very much appreciated. And if you feel that you can, then you will receive a quarterly magazine full of fun facts, quizzes, activities, and more, just for helping me to be able to create all of this and supporting me. All help is very much appreciated. That's me done for this week. So, Madrigals next week.